In the first installment of this time-lapse series, you saw me build the frames for the lower staging level. The next order of business now is to get the bus wires in. You can see that box resting on the corner of one of the Helix frames. That's my box of 14 gauge bus wires. And right in the foreground, next to the miter saw, is my box of terminal blocks. I need one terminal block at each benchwork joint so that I can separate the wires and rejoin them easily again upon installation. And it's not just a simple case of one pair of bus wires, because it is intended to have all these staging tracks individually isolatable. And since there are 9 tracks, that means 9 additional single bus wires. And I have to run those all the way around the U shape at the far end of the room. The ones on the outside are significantly longer than the ones on the inside though, because of the shape of the end ladders. You'll see me lay those out later in this video. Since you can't really see what I'm doing in the distance, I'm just going to skip to the next portion of this job. Now I've put the box of bus wires away. I've got out some sawhorses and a sheet of plywood, because I now have to cut the tops for the staging yard. Now at the time I only had 3 sheets of 1/2-inch plywood available, and it's a pretty tight fit. I used every last bit of it, and then I had to go to the store the next day to buy another truckload so I could continue with the build. That low-level piece that I'm installing now is the base for the tall trestle, where the second scenic level drops right through the staging level. And now I'm screwing down the first piece. I elected to start with the long straight piece along the back wall, just a basic 2x8 section, and then I moved on to the L-shaped pieces in the corners, and I had to cut small infill pieces because they didn't quite reach the end. Those corner sections are about 5 feet wide, and of course the ply was only 4 foot wide. It's surprising how many screws that I need to put in these 3 sheets of plywood. You may see me continually trimming the pieces. That's not because I made mistakes the first time round, it's just I left them oversized, so I could still trim them to fit exactly. I'm not quite sure what was in those bags I've just brought in. Obviously something I needed. You saw me get out my new toy. I bought an air stapler for this job, and the easiest way of attaching the ends of the wires where they terminate is to just staple them to the framing. I bought that the same day that I bought the next pile of plywood. So now you see me cutting a piece to fill in the bottom of one of the helixes, and I am marking out a 16-pointed star. Well, first I had to plot the center point of the helix, and now I'm marking out a 16-pointed star, so I know exactly where the supports need to be. You'll see me build radial joists later on to support the lower level of the helix, each one being 1/4 of an inch wider than the previous. Now what I'm doing is marking out a whole load of sub-road bed for the helix. And here my MO is to mark out one segment as long as I possibly can, and then draw around bits of it to cut as many short pieces as I can out of the rest of the sheet. There is very little wastage. You may hear of some people saying that by building their helixes in a hexagon instead of a circle, there's no wastage. Well, that's a fallacy. The only difference being that all the waste areas are still attached to their helix where they get in the way of access. You're much better off cutting those curves and throwing away the offcuts. Now I'm cutting a second sheet. I did this one slightly differently. I wanted to get 2 half circles out of the sheet, and to do that I had to put one each way so they're partially one inside the other. Now the total yield on the sheet is not quite as good that way, but I had my reasons for it. I wanted to get those 2 half circles so I could join them together to make a ring to plot the bottom of the helix with. And what I'm doing now is cutting up all the scrap and throwing it away so I'm not tripping over it. Okay, now you see me joining those 2 half circles together to make a full circle, and then I draw around it everywhere across the joists, so that way I know the other pieces are in the right place. Before I start assembling anything on the helix, I am marking out all the sub-road bed pieces joining that far helix to the staging yard via a long S-bend. And you saw I didn't quite have enough offcuts, so I had to get out another partial sheet to make one of the pieces out of it. I don't like wasting materials. We'll basically use up all of this. I think I'm pretty efficient at using materials for minimal wastage. This was one of those parts of the job where it was convenient to be able to open the front garage doors so I could work from the outside. Now I'm starting to shim up the ends of the staging yard, putting in a very gradual vertical curve at the start of the 2% grade. It's worth taking your time and getting those vertical curves as near perfect as you possibly can, especially where there are turnouts involved. Now with that done, I am working on the grade through that reverse curve at the back of that second vehicular door, continuing the 2% grade all the way around through the reverse curve towards the helix. I keep having to come back to the miter saw to cut more risers, because at this point I'd already used up all my offcuts. There you saw me get a wide strip of plywood out, and I cut a short piece off the end of it. What I'm doing now is ripping the risers for the start of the Helix. As I said before, each one is 1/4 of an inch wider than the previous one. And since they are all exactly the same distance apart, radially from the center, that gives me a very smooth grade throughout the Helix. And with 16 of them, of course, I end up with exactly a 4-inch rise at the end of the first lap. You may notice I'm doing a lot of angled cuts on the miter saw. That's because I'm trimming them off at the 22.5 and 45-degree angles where they cross the outer frame. And later on you'll see me install brackets to make sure that they remain plumb and that they don't move. Because I feel it's very important that Motorora benchwork be as solid as can be. With all those pieces installed, you saw me loosen the clamps and drop the marker board out through the bottom of the hole and put it on the other Helix where I'll reuse it later. And now I'm systematically attaching the sub-road bed to each of the risers. Those little pieces that I'm cutting now are the brackets that I talked about earlier. There I had to check the alignment with another piece of sub-road bed. Just confirming the alignment again. Now I'm taking the half circle away and using a much smaller piece because I don't want to overlap the start until I've got the track in. Now it's time to repeat all those processes on the other Helix. I start by having to modify that board because this one is in a slightly different location relative to the frame. But once I've got it stored in the right place, I can reassemble the circle and mark it out. And now I have to work on getting the sub-road bed joined up between the staging yard and this Helix. And this one is a lot simpler than the other one because it's basically a straight shot. And there I am just extending the radial lines onto the framing. Now I'm getting in the risers on the approach piece. Now you saw another wide piece of wood come out, so I can rip it into all the various widths that I need. Just sand them quickly. And now we're going around assembling the bottom lap of the Helix. Installing all the risers, trimming them off at the right lengths and angles as necessary. manufacturing a whole load more of those little brackets to keep the ends vertical. And now once again I'm using that last half circle to get the alignment right for the last few risers. I'm not going to install that piece just yet because, as I said earlier, I don't want to overlap the entry level before I got the track on it. There you saw a quarter circle go in, which is about as long a piece as I can put in without going over the top of the first lap. Now I'm ripping up door skin plywood to make the safety fences that go around the edge. They go all the way along both sides of all the hidden sub-road bed, basically everywhere that there's no scenery to catch trains that derail, although really there is no reason for the trains to ever derail, but accidents do happen. I'm attaching them with glue and air staples. I didn't cut quite enough of the fences, so I'm making a few more here. Ultimately, I will use up nearly 3 full sheets on the railroad, but for the time being, I'm just cutting less than 1. Making sure all the splinters are sanded off, because I hate to get splinters in my hands. What I'm doing now is making a tool to help me accurately cut the foam rubber roadbed. I bought big rolls and I'm cutting it into 1¼ inch wide strips because that is the cheapest way of doing it. I bought 400-foot rolls of both thicknesses that I need. I just put the table saw away because I don't need it for a while. And I'm giving the place a good sweep up because I've stopped making sawdust for a few days. And I'm making sure I get rid of all the dust from the sub-road bed because otherwise the foam rubber won't stick to it. And here you may notice the camera got messed up on me, suddenly went out of focus. I must apologize for that. I've left this part in because it was a lot of visible progress on that day. So I'm really annoyed about the quality or the lack of quality of the picture. You see the roll of roadbed on the device that I made earlier. I'm laying it down on the staging yard in wide sheets instead of individual tracks. It goes a lot quicker that way, and the layout is not so critical. I started with a straight section across the back, then I worked my way out in both directions. Now with all the large sheets laid, I am cutting the offcuts into the 1¼ inch wide strips for use on the single main lines to and around the Helix. Although you probably can't see it, I just went inside to get the box of turnouts so that I can lay out the staging yard approaches just so I get the foam road bit in the right place. Now I'm adding that around one of the helixes. And now I head over to the other side and repeat the process over there. Fortunately, the out of focus situation only lasted for one day because I reviewed the footage that night and I was able to go back to factory settings. What I'm doing now is starting to work on the track lane, and since you couldn't really see what I was doing in the distance, I decided to experiment with different camera locations. I've got one time-lapse camera set up over each side of the workshop, so you will see a variety of different viewpoints. I'm starting on the west ladder. First worked out where the turnouts have to go, join them together in 2s and 3s, drilled all the holes for the switch machines. And now I'm using Crafter's Pick glue to glue the track down, weighting them in place with my Fast Tracks filing jigs. Normally I use cans of Mountain Dew, but I did this in the middle of winter where the temperature dropped below freezing overnight. And I didn't want to turn up in the morning and find burst cans of Mountain Dew making a big mess. After getting all but one of the turnouts in, I then started working on the curves around the corner. The previous day I had already done the first 6 tracks at the other end, but you couldn't see it. Not only was the camera too far away, but it was done during the really crappy out of focus day. The client gave me a whole box of assorted flex track, which included 8 pieces of concrete ties, and that was just about long enough to do the middle of the 9 straighting tracks. So I felt that was a good idea to do it there, which gives a visual placeholder, making it a lot easier to see which track you're on. Then there was enough regular Atlas flex track to do, I think, 5 of the other tracks, and I ended up with 3 more tracks done with new Pico track. The inside tracks are about 11 feet long, and the longest one around the outside is close to 30. So most of the tracks will take multiple trains. You saw me come back and put in the last turnout, because the end of it is a compound ladder. Here is a view from the other side of the workshop on the other camera. I cut out most of this morning's activity because you really couldn't see what I was doing at the far end. But with the far ladder done, I'm now working down the straight along the back wall, joining up with the track that I laid the previous day. Now with the far end complete, it's time to move the tools over to this end so I can finish the track in this corner. I still have the back 3 tracks to do and one more turnout. You may notice that I'm using scraps of wood cut to the right width as spacers on the curves. And in most cases on the curves, I'm joining the track together into 6-foot lengths so that I can keep most of the joints on the straight. The track's more reliable that way. Now it looks like all the curved track at this end is done. It's just a case of joining up the last 3 tracks along the straight wall. And here is a view of me finishing off that back wall from that first camera angle again. So that staging yard took me about 1.5 days to lay all the track. And now I'm moving around to the approaches around the helixes. Get the first lap of the track in both sides before I continue with the bench work. You may notice that today I have one of my dogs out here with me. Zeus is a pretty good workshop companion. Now on the helixes, I'm switching from the Pico to the microengineering track. The reason for that being that although the microengineering is very difficult to bend into a smooth easement, it does keep its shape nicely. So it's great for long circular curves because there is no tendency for the rail ends to spring out on the curves. In fact, I start off each helix by making a special piece where I solder one piece of microengineering track to one piece of Pico. As you can see, I keep jumping from one camera angle to the other, splicing together the various segments to try to give you the best view of whatever I'm doing at the moment. I wasn't checking the level then, I was using it at a straight edge just to make sure that I didn't have any kinks in it. But with the track laying completed, I now have to go back with the feeder wires. You saw me get out another big box, this time with all the code 20 feeder wires in it. All the same colors as before. I bought 200 feet of each in 10 different colors, plus green for frogs. I'm just systematically starting at one end and working my way around. First hooking up the tops and then going back on the creeper and hooking them up below. And you can see that today I have my other dog out here with me. And then I went in at lunchtime and switched my Doberman for my pit bull. Now I'm hooking up the DCC system so I can test the track. It's very important to test it as you go. The last thing you want to do is install several hundred feeders, then put a locomotive on the track and find that you have a dead short, because it may take a long time to find it. Now, the first locomotive I tried to use for testing was just set with such a high momentum control that it was worthless for testing. Great for operation, but no good for testing. So I went inside and got one of my own standard-equipped locomotives with the momentum turned off, because when I'm testing, I like the locomotive to respond to my throttle commands immediately. Here is another view of that same sequence from a different camera. You saw me running the bus wires. And then do the tops of the feeders and then the bottoms. All this while Duke the Doberman looks on. Anyway, that is the staging level pretty much done. I didn't even bother to record time-lapse on the day that I installed all the switch machines because you wouldn't have been able to see anything. Next, it's time to extend those helixes up to the lower scenic level, but that will be a topic for a different video.